This is the new stimulus bill that was proposed in the Senate just yesterday, May 8th. I read it, so you don't have to. And in this video, I'm gonna explain exactly what it says and if I think it has a chance of being passed or not. Welcome to my channel. My name's Anthony Bodanza. I'll help you make more money and live on less because you deserve to really live. And unfortunately, this pandemic that we're living in has caused a lot of people to not be able to actually live the life that they want to. And because of that, we've seen rounds of stimulus come before that I've already posted videos on, so we'll just cut right to the chase. This new stimulus bill proposed yesterday called the Monthly Economic Crisis Support Act was introduced to the Senate and has some of the most generous provisions that I've seen yet. I'm gonna walk through the bill so that we don't leave anything out and you guys can understand fully what this stimulus package means, because I've already seen people misrepresenting what this bill is. Now, first off, this bill hasn't been passed yet. It has been read in the Senate already. However, there is no guarantee that this is going to actually pass. I want to get that out of the way right off the bat. This is going to be a tax credit similar to the economic impact payments that you might have already received, your $1,200 or $2,400 stimulus payment. So it's not going to be repaid back to the government. It's going to be a 2020 tax credit. The rules and regulations that are surrounding this bill are pretty similar to the CARES Act that was already passed. There's going to be an income limitation, a phase out, and an amount for dependents that's paid out. However, the amount and restrictions in this bill are way more lenient than the CARES Act were. Now let's get into how much this bill would pay. For every eligible recipient, which we'll get into in a second, they would receive $2,000 per individual. And for every dependent, they would receive $2,000 up to 3 dependents. Now that's a lot more than the CARES Act, because in the CARES Act, it was only $1,200 per individual and $500 per dependent, and your dependent couldn't be over the age of 16. In this bill, there's no such stipulation. So any dependent, whether they're a child older than 16 or a disabled person, would qualify for the $2,000 to the person who claimed them as a dependent. What's crazy about that is that would mean if you meet the income qualifications and you're married and you have 3 children, you would get $10,000 per month. That's $120,000 per year salary, tax-free. Now, the second important qualification is the income qualification. Now, this has also been raised from the CARES Act. In the CARES Act, it was $75,000 per individual, and then it would be phased out up to $100,000. In the Monthly Economic Crisis Support Act that is proposed, the income limitation would be $100,000. And then it would phase out up to $120,000. And it phases out at $10 per $100 over the $100,000 or $200,000 limit. That means if you make $110,000, instead of getting the $2,000 payment, you'd only get $1,000. Now remember, this is based on your adjusted gross income, which is an important tax term, and if you don't know what it is, watch this video here and it'll explain the American tax system to you. The stimulus checks that we've already gotten were one-time payments. This bill starts with the word monthly, so you can probably assume it's gonna be more than one time. So how long exactly will this proposed stimulus plan take place? Well, it actually starts in March of 2020, and I know you're saying, Anthony, it's already May. How does that work? And I'll get to that in a second, but it would end 3 months after the Secretary of Health and Human Services determines the public health emergency that was declared on January 31st to be over. On January 31st, the Secretary of Health and Human Services declared the coronavirus a national health emergency. That means that there will be a point in time when he states that it is no longer a national health emergency, and 3 months after that is when these payments will stop. Now, how does March 2020 fit into this? Because we've already been through March and April, and if this bill takes a while to get passed, even if it does get passed, we'll already have been through May. Those payments that you would have received in March and April will be paid out as fast as humanly possible after this bill gets passed, if it does. The exact language of the bill says the Secretary shall refund or credit any overpayment attributable to this section as rapidly as possible. The important part of that is as rapidly as possible. That means that if you're married filing jointly like me and Carissa, then we would get those $4,000 payments from March, April, and May all together as fast as possible. 12 grand. That's a little crazy. So now, I can already hear you asking me, there's gotta be some people who aren't eligible for this payment. And there are, but unlike the CARES Act, it's a lot less people. There are 3 people who are left out of this. A non-resident alien, meaning that you are someone who immigrated to America and hasn't obtained any documentation that they are a resident of America now. A dependent, and an estate or trust. Now, I know you're thinking, Anthony, you already said that dependents get money, and that is correct. The dependent himself isn't gonna get the payment even though they qualify for it. It's the person who claimed them as a dependent who is the eligible individual. I hope that clears it up. After that part, it's saying that the income numbers are based off the 2019 tax year, and then it gets into the timing of payments, which we went over already, as soon as possible. But what if you haven't filed your tax returns for 2019 yet because the IRS extended that until July 15th of 2020? And I know if you're familiar with the stimulus check rules that came came out already, they would just use your 2018 tax return, and that is what's gonna be done here as well. However, and this is pretty interesting, if you haven't filed a tax return for 2018 or 2019, the government is still going to do everything that they can to get you this payment. The bill says that they're going to use any applicable information provided by any relevant federal and state agencies. These would be agencies like SNAP, which is the food assistance program, Medicare, which is the disability assistance program, housing assistance programs, Social Security, or pension funds. This will make it easier for all Americans to get these payments without jumping through so many hoops like they had to during the CARES Act. As you know, the IRS portal for getting your stimulus payment probably wasn't the easiest thing to do if you didn't file those tax returns. The next part of the bill is pretty boring. It just says that the Secretary of Treasury is gonna have to coordinate with those other state and federal agencies in order to get all that information. However, something else that's really cool about this that wasn't a provision for the last stimulus checks is that the Secretary is gonna have to look for any information for individuals who may be eligible, including methods specifically designed to identify and account for foster youth and individuals experiencing homelessness. Whether or not this bill gets passed or another stimulus bill, if another stimulus bill does get passed, I really hope that there's a provision like this who will help out the most vulnerable in our communities. However, just knowing that some of these people were there wouldn't have been enough during the last stimulus bill because we wouldn't have had addresses for them. In this stimulus bill, there's a couple of different updates to how payments to this can be made. And I've counted 4 main ways. The last one I hope doesn't even need to be used at all. The first one, similar to the stimulus payments that we've already had, is direct deposit. If you have direct deposit information, the government can use that to give you this payment. The second way is prepaid cards. Now I know we've already seen this with the Automatic Boost to Communities Act that was proposed. However, one of the ways that's laid out that this can be paid to individuals is through prepaid reloadable cards, which would be really helpful for some people in those communities that we've already talked about who are more vulnerable. The third way is through online payment systems, which would be like Cash App, Venmo, Zelle, anything like that. That way communities who are less banked or don't have banking relationships wouldn't need them to get this payment. And then the last way that I don't hope anyone needs is by mail. But if there are people who are older and prefer it that way, that's their prerogative. One question that you might have right now is, since this bill is retroactive to March, meaning that they'll give you payments from March and April, will you get an extra $2,000 if you've already received your $1,200 stimulus payment during one of those months? The answer to that is no, because in the next section, it talks about the reduction of your initial payment. Basically, it just means if you got a $1,200 stimulus check and you were gonna get $2,000 for that same month, then you would only get $800 for that month instead because the government already gave you that $1,200. The next section most people won't have to worry about, but there's no interest that's allowed to accrue on this money. If you don't claim this until next year, you can't charge the government interest for them holding onto the money. And then something else that's really important to combat fraud and scamming is similar to the last stimulus check that came out. They will have to send you a notice in the mail no later than 15 days after a payment has been made for every single payment that you get during this period, notifying you how the payment was made, what date the payment was made, and the amount of the payments. And there also will be a number to the IRS that you can reach out to for any disputes in terms of that notice. The next couple of sections are going to talk about how it's similar or different to the CARES Act, which we've already covered in a lot of ways. And then it talks about some of the prohibitions that come with this payment, which is really cool because during the last stimulus check, and I hope this didn't happen to you, financial institutions like banks and credit unions were allowed to garnish those payments or freeze the account because you had outstanding debts that were needing to be collected. Basically, if you had to go to court for debt collection and they ordered a freeze on your accounts or a garnishment of your wages, whenever money would go into that account, banks would put a hold on that money so you couldn't actually access it, and then they would pay the collections agencies first with that funds. This bill makes it illegal for that to happen. So even if you have your wages being garnished, you are still going to receive the full benefit of this amount. Another important provision that this bill has in terms of banks is that banks can't charge you at all to get access to these funds. If they send you one of these checks in the mail, they can't charge you a fee for cashing that check. It's illegal. Now there's really only one more section that we haven't talked about in this bill, and it's because it's a little bit confusing to me still. And I've looked around a little bit and it is a very new proposal, so I understand why it might be like this. However, how is this bill going to be funded? In the language of the bill, it says that immediately upon enactment of this act, out of any money in the Treasury not otherwise appropriated, there shall be appropriated $250 billion to the Department of the Treasury to carry out the purposes in this section of the IRS code. Basically, that means that whenever this gets passed, they're gonna send $250 billion immediately to the Department of the Treasury. However, the next part of the sentence says, to remain available until expended. I don't know if that means until this initial $250 billion payment is expended, or they're just gonna replenish that $250 billion until the coronavirus is expended, which wouldn't make as much sense to me. And honestly, that $250 billion wouldn't go very far under this bill. And so on that note, let's get into whether or not I think this has a great chance of passing. Let's take a look at a little bit of the numbers. And I promise, it's a little bit of the numbers. General estimates for this past stimulus bill that went out was that it was going out to 150 million people. That's with less lenient restrictions. So more people will be getting payments under this bill if it passes. But let's just take that $150 billion number and multiply it by $2,000 per month, because that's the minimum. And that doesn't even include how much more people will be getting per dependent, and more dependents will be included, and there will be more people included under this bill because you just have to be an American resident, not an American citizen. During the last stimulus check, you actually needed a social security number, whereas now you just need to be a registered resident. If we take a look at that $150 million times $2,000, it's $300 billion per month. So in 1 month, that $250 billion would be expended. So it would seem to me like that's not a very good paragraph to have in here. And honestly, I'm not a tax professional. I'm not a political professional. I can definitely be wrong in any of this. And if I am, please let me know down below. But also, we talked about how this is a retroactive bill. So if it gets passed today, payments for March and April will have to go out as soon as possible, like the bill says. That would mean that $600 billion would need to go out as soon as possible to just those people. That's not including all the extra money that's gonna be paid out. So, and I know I've been saying so a lot, it seems like that $250 billion doesn't really last very long at all. Maybe like 2 days after payments actually start being made to Americans. And then the other question that I have about the funding of this is it gonna be funded by debt or by money? Neither of them are good. I know money funded sounds pretty good, but it just means that America prints more money. Either way, this is gonna be a lot of money that has to be paid out, which is one of the reasons why it's going to have some hindrances in terms of getting passed. The other reason why it's gonna be a little bit harder for it to get passed is because President Trump has said that the next stimulus bill that comes across his desk has to have payroll tax cuts on it for him to sign it. Obviously that can change, however, this has no hint of payroll tax cuts, so if we're just going off what the president himself said, it's not gonna get passed through him. However, if you want this bill to be passed, there is a little bit of hope here. If we just look at the last couple of months, and I made a video on the timeline of all these stimulus packages coming through, you'll see that a lot of people are wanting more stimulus. A lot of Americans need it to continue to survive if states reopening isn't as good as people think it's going to be. And this $2,000 per month number keeps getting thrown around. In this bill, in the Emergency Money for the People Act, in the Automatic Boost to Communities Act, $2,000 seems to be a pretty consistent number across the board, at least in terms of one of the payments. And honestly, as someone who really deeply cares for people, as well as really cares about personal financial responsibility, it's hard for me to decide whether or not I want these stimulus bills to pass. On one hand, which I think is the more important hand, which is the human part of it, people need to make sure that they can live and eat and have dignity. That's a really important thing. On the other hand, no one really knows what this is gonna mean economically. People can really say whatever they want. Some people think that this is gonna be the best thing ever. Some people think this is gonna cause hyperinflation and America's economy is gonna tank. But honestly, nobody knows for sure. Everybody in the world is in this together, and it's new to everyone. So we really don't know what's gonna happen. However, as more stimulus bills do get proposed and we see America's government trying to figure out what to do with this pandemic, I'll continue to let you guys know what's going on. So hit the like button if this video brought you any value and subscribe to my channel. It would really mean a lot to me, and I know that it'll help you in the long run.